The frost came early to Montana that year, and it found Lydia Harlan kneeling in the dirt at the edge of a dead man's orchard, gathering bruised apples that had fallen and rotted half into the ground. She was 26 years old, 3 days on the road, a canvas bag with almost nothing left in it, and a stomach that had stopped complaining somewhere around the second night, the way hunger does when it finally understands you aren't going to feed it. Nobody had run her out of town. That was the strange cruelty of it. No one had shouted, no one had pointed a finger. They had simply turned, quietly, one debt collector and one church lady at a time, until there was nothing left in that town that belonged to her anymore. A man on a gray horse stopped on the road above her. He didn't speak right away. He looked at the apples in her hands, the worn-through soles of her boots, the bag she carried like it still held something worth protecting, and the particular set of her jaw that meant she was holding her pride together with both hands. Then he asked her one question, not her name, not where she'd come from, just this: "Can you keep a stove warm for two?" What that woman said back to him, and what she built in the months that followed, would change a ranch nobody believed could be saved, and a man nobody believed could be reached. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's ride. Montana Territory, 1884. The kind of country that didn't care whether you survived it or not, and made you prove every single day that you intended to. Lydia Harlan had grown up in a roadhouse on the Bozeman Trail, the kind of place where wagon trains stopped for the night, and her father fed 40 strangers off 2 stoves and a will that never quit. She had learned to cook before she learned to read properly. She had learned to count sacks of flour and barrels of salt pork before she learned to dance. She had learned, long before she understood why it mattered, that a full table was the difference between a house and a home. She had married Daniel Harlan at 19 because he made her laugh and because her father liked him, and for 3 years that had been enough. Then Daniel had borrowed against land that wasn't fully his to borrow against, chasing a silver claim that never paid, and when the fever took him in the spring, it left Lydia with his debts and very little else. The men who held those debts did not care that she had loved him. They came with papers and patient voices and took the roadhouse, the furniture, even her mother's good cookware, piece by piece, the way men take things when the law is on their side and shame is not in their vocabulary. The town had watched it happen. Some of them had looked away out of decency. Most had looked away out of relief that it wasn't their door the collectors were standing at. Either way, by the time it was finished, Lydia Harlan understood with total clarity that a widow with debts was not a person to a town like that. She was a problem that solved itself if you waited long enough. So she walked north, because north was the direction the road went, and because staying meant becoming a story the church ladies told each other in quiet, satisfied voices. She had been 3 days on that road, sleeping in a hollow under a wagon bridge the first night, and against the lee side of a hay barn the second, when she came across the dead orchard. Whoever had planted it was long gone. The trees were untended, half wild, but they had borne fruit anyway, stubborn the way things in that country tended to be, and the ground beneath them was scattered with apples too bruised for anyone to want. Lydia was on her knees, sorting the worst of them from the merely bad, when she heard a horse on the road above her and felt, more than saw, someone watching. Caleb Rowan was 43 years old and had not said more than was necessary to another human being in longer than he could easily account for. He ran 4,000 acres along the creek that carried his family's name, 300 head of cattle, and a house that had been quiet for 6 years, since the fever took his wife Margaret the same season it had apparently taken Lydia's husband, though neither of them knew that yet. He did not ride down into the orchard. He didn't dismount with any drama, didn't offer his hand or his pity, both of which Lydia had learned to recognize and resent in roughly equal measure over the past 3 days. He simply sat the gray horse at the fence line and looked at her, at the bruised apples in her hands, at boots that had given up somewhere around Wyoming, at the canvas bag she held like there was something inside worth defending, though there wasn't, not anymore. And he took her measure the way a man takes the measure of a horse he's thinking of buying. Not unkindly, just honestly. "Those won't keep you a day," he said finally. "They're keeping me right now," she said, and didn't stop sorting. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the bare branches above them. Somewhere behind him, his cattle made their low, contented sound in a pasture she couldn't see yet. "Can you keep a stove warm for 2?" he asked. She looked up at him properly for the first time. Not a question about charity. Not a question dressed up to disguise pity as kindness, the way some men's questions were. A practical question, asked by a practical man, the way you'd ask whether someone could mend fence or break a horse. Something in her straightened. "I can keep it warm for 20, she said, "if you've got flour and a roof." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the way men in that country nodded when a deal was struck and didn't need to be said twice. "I've got both," he said. "Rowan Creek, 4 miles north." He didn't offer to carry her bag. He didn't offer his arm. He simply turned the gray horse and started walking it at the pace of a man on foot beside him, which she understood, after a moment, was its own kind of courtesy. He had given the horse to slow himself down to her rather than ask her to hurry to keep up with him. They walked the 4 miles, mostly in silence, and Lydia Harlan, who had spent 3 days being looked at like a problem, found she did not mind the silence at all. It was the first silence in a long while that didn't feel like judgment. The house, when they reached it, told its own story before either of them said another word. It was a good house, solidly built, the kind a man puts real money and real care into when he intends to raise a family in it. But it had the particular stillness of a place that had stopped being lived in, only worked from. The porch step was sound, but the rail was loose. The curtains, what was left of them, hung the way curtains hang when no one has thought about them in years. And the kitchen, when Caleb pushed open the door and let her go in ahead of him, smelled of old grease and cold coffee and the particular staleness of a room where meals were cooked out of necessity and eaten standing up. There were sacks of flour and cornmeal stacked against one wall, half of them open and going soft with damp. There was a stove with a film of old fat baked onto every surface. There were dishes, washed but not put away, stacked in a way that suggested a man who cleaned only when the alternative became unbearable. Lydia set her bag down on the one clean corner of the table and looked around the room with the same assessing eye Caleb had turned on her at the orchard fence. "This kitchen hasn't been cooked in," she said. "It's been cooked at." Caleb stood in the doorway with his hat still in his hand. "That's a fair way to put it." "There's a difference, you know," she said, already moving toward the stove, "between feeding a man and feeding a house." He didn't answer that. He set a sack of flour on the table, told her where the well was and where the smokehouse stood, mentioned that there'd be men coming in 3 days' time for the fall gather and that they'd want feeding too, and then he left her alone in the kitchen, the way a man leaves a room he doesn't quite trust himself to stay in. Lydia stood there a moment after he'd gone, in a stranger's kitchen, in a stranger's house, 4 miles from a road that had nearly finished her, and felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she wanted to admit. Not safety, exactly. Usefulness. The two were not the same thing, but for a woman who had spent 3 days being nothing at all to anyone, usefulness was close enough. She did not cook a feast that first evening. She cleaned. She scrubbed the stove down to the iron, sorted the flour that could still be saved from the flour that couldn't, found the smokehouse half-stocked with meat going to waste from neglect rather than spoilage, and counted every sack and barrel in the place with the quick, practiced eye of a woman who had learned to read a larder the way other people read a letter. By the time Caleb came in from the barn that evening, the kitchen smelled different. Not grand, a simple stew, made from what she'd found and what little he had, but seasoned properly and served hot, in a kitchen that had been swept and aired for the first time in longer than either of them said out loud. He stopped in the doorway. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just stood there and let the smell of it settle over him, the way a man stands in the rain after a long drought, not quite trusting that it's really happening. "Smells like someone lives here," he said finally. "Someone does," Lydia said, "for now." He sat down. He ate. He did not say it was good, because Caleb Rowan was not a man given to easy compliments, but he ate every bit of it, and looked, when he finished, like a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be full of something besides work. The fall gather arrived 3 days later. 8 men and a foreman named Hutch Boyle, who had worked the Rowan spread for 11 years and had long ago given up expecting the cookhouse to be anything but burnt bacon, hard bread, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. They came in that first evening, expecting the usual, and they got something else. Lydia had spent 2 days planning for them, stretching what little stores the ranch had with the same instinct that had carried her father's roadhouse through 20 years of feeding strangers. Beans soaked and seasoned properly, bread that had actually risen, a roast stretched thin across enough plates that every man at the table got his fill without the larder going empty. The men were quiet at first, the particular quiet of hard men who don't quite know what to do when something is better than they expected. Then they ate, and one by one, plates went clean, and the talk around the table got easier, and by the time the meal was done, something in the room had shifted that none of them could have named directly. Hutch Boyle scraped the last of his plate clean and looked up the table at her with an expression somewhere between suspicion and gratitude. "Ma'am," he said, "where'd Mr. Rowan find you?" "On the side of the road," Lydia said, "picking up apples nobody wanted." Hutch looked at her for a long moment, then looked at Caleb, who was very deliberately not looking at anyone. Hutch didn't say anything else. But the next morning, when the men came in from the bunkhouse, every one of them wiped his boots at the door before he stepped inside, without being asked, and Lydia understood that something had been settled the night before that none of them had spoken aloud. The ranch did not change all at once. It changed the way frost changes a field, slowly, then all at once, until one morning you looked out and the whole world was different, and you couldn't quite say when it had happened. Lydia did not announce herself, she simply worked. She mended the loose hinge on the pantry door because it bothered her more than it bothered anyone else. She found Caleb's mother's good china, packed away and forgotten in a crate in the cellar, and brought one piece of it out at a time, washed and set on the shelf until the kitchen had something in it besides function. She kept a ledger, her own small notebook, separate from Caleb's, because she had learned from her father that a woman who kept her own count was a woman who couldn't be talked out of what she knew to be true. Caleb noticed all of it, the way he noticed weather, carefully, from a slight distance, the way a man watches something he isn't sure he's allowed to want. He noticed the loose board on the back stairs had been fixed before he got around to fixing it himself, and the next day, without saying anything about it, he sharpened every knife in the kitchen and oiled the hinge on the stove door that had been sticking for 2 years. She noticed that, too. The next morning, there was warm apple bread on the table when he came in from the barn, made from the same bruised fruit she'd been gathering the day they met, because nothing in Lydia Harlan's kitchen went to waste if there was any use left in it. He brought her good coffee and a fresh sack of flour the next time he rode into town, set them on the table without comment, the way a man leaves an offering he isn't ready to call by its name. That evening, she used the spice he favored, the one she'd noticed he reached for without thinking and never asked for directly, in the stew, and said nothing about it either. Neither of them spoke of what was happening, but both of them knew the other had seen it. Caleb Rowan's wound, the one he carried under his quiet and his work and his careful distance, was this. He had loved a woman in this house once, and the fever had taken her in 11 days, and somewhere in the burying of her he had decided, without ever saying it out loud, that a warm house was a dangerous thing to want. You couldn't lose what you refused to let yourself have. He had kept the ranch alive for 6 years on that principle, and it had cost him the ranch's soul to do it. Lydia Harlan's wound was different, but no less real. She had spent the last year of her life being looked at as a burden, a widow, a debt, a problem the town had been relieved to see walk north out of sight. What she wanted, more than food, more than shelter, more than safety, was to be seen as useful, not pitied, needed. What Caleb did right, without ever quite understanding that he was doing anything at all, was that he never once offered her pity. He offered her a stove, and a roof, and trust, and let her prove, in her own time and her own way, exactly what she was capable of. And that, more than any kindness with a softer name, was the thing that began, slowly, to put both of them back together. The trouble arrived in late November, the way trouble in that country always seemed to, riding in clean and well-dressed and calling itself an opportunity. Gideon Vale was not a banker. He made a point of saying so, in the particular tone of a man who wanted credit for honesty he wasn't actually offering. He was a grain and credit broker who worked closely enough with the bank in town that the distinction meant little in practice. He rode onto the Rowan Creek spread on a gray afternoon with the first hard frost still silvering the grass, and he came with the kind of smile that had learned, over many years, exactly how much warmth to show and exactly when to let it go cold. Caleb had taken a loan against the spring drought the year before, when the creek had run low and half his hay crop had failed before it could be cut. The note was coming due. He had been counting on selling the bulk of his herd to clear it. Vale's news was not the news Caleb had been hoping for. "Beef's down," Vale said, settling into a chair at Caleb's table without quite being invited to sit, "and shipping costs are up. What you'll get for that herd this season won't cover what you owe. Not by a fair margin." Caleb's jaw tightened. "That herd's worth more than that, and you know it." "It's worth what the market says it's worth," Vale said pleasantly, "and the market isn't kind this year." He let that sit a moment, the way a man lets a hook sit before he sets it. "I'll be honest with you, Rowan, because I think you'd rather hear it plain. I'm prepared to extend the note, generously, in exchange for the creek bottom acreage, the south parcel, the one that holds water clean through winter. I've got buyers who'd pay well for ground like that, and you'd keep the rest of your spread clear of debt entirely." It was, Caleb understood with a cold drop in his stomach, not an offer to help him. It was an offer to take the single most valuable piece of ground he owned, the water that made the rest of the ranch worth anything at all, for a fraction of what it was worth, while he was too cornered to argue the price. He opened his mouth to refuse it outright, and found, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he didn't have the numbers to back the refusal. The herd wouldn't cover the note. He knew it the moment Vale said it, because he'd done the arithmetic himself 3 nights running and come up short every time. The silence stretched. Out in the yard, the men had gone quiet too, the particular quiet of hired hands who can feel trouble in a house even through closed windows. It was then that the kitchen door opened and Lydia stepped through it, still in her flour-dusted apron, with Caleb's worn account book in one hand and her own small notebook in the other. Vale glanced at her with the polite dismissal of a man who didn't consider a cook's opinion relevant to a business conversation. "This isn't a family matter," he said. "It's a business matter." "Then you'll want the right numbers," Lydia said. and set both books on the table. She opened her own notebook first. For 6 weeks, she explained, she had been keeping account of everything that came through that kitchen, every sack of grain going soft with damp, every cut of meat left to spoil because there was no time to process it properly, every scrap that should have gone to the smokehouse instead of the waste pile. She had cleaned out the old stone smokehouse behind the barn, unused for years, and through the fall she had been salting and smoking the surplus meat from every butchering, quietly, methodically, building a stock of cured beef and pork that hadn't existed before she arrived. "There's a railroad camp going up east of town," she said. 40 men, no cook worth the name, and a paymaster handing out wages every Friday with nowhere good to spend them. They're paying premium for salted meat, good bread, and coffee that doesn't taste like creek water. I asked at the mercantile. I wrote down the prices. She turned her notebook so Vale could see the figures, written in a clear, careful hand that had clearly been keeping accounts a great deal longer than this past month. If Mr. Rowan sells a portion of the herd live, as planned, he takes a loss at this season's prices, same as you say. But if a portion of that herd is processed here, cured, smoked, sold by the pound to a camp that's hungry and paying cash, the return is considerably better than market price for live cattle. I've run the numbers against what's owed on the note. She slid the page toward him. It clears it, with room to spare, if the weather holds for 1 more month of smoking. The kitchen was very quiet. Hutch Boyle, who had drifted in from the yard under the pretense of fetching coffee and had clearly heard every word, was looking at Lydia with an expression that had moved well past suspicion into something close to awe. Vale looked at the numbers for a long moment. Then he looked at Lydia, and something in his polite, practiced smile faltered, just slightly, the way a man's confidence falters when he realizes the easy mark he came for has turned out not to be so easy after all. "You did this," he said, "in your kitchen." "I did this," Lydia said, "because waste doesn't sit well with me. It never has." Caleb said nothing. He sat very still, looking at the woman standing beside him in a flour-dusted apron, holding a notebook that had just done what he, with all his years on this land, had not managed to do, found a way through, where he had only been able to see a wall. Vale gathered his hat after a moment, his pleasant manner thinning into something colder and more honest. "This isn't finished, Rowan," he said. "I expect not," Caleb said. "Come back in spring. I'll have the note paid by then." Vale rode out. He did not come back that winter. That night, Caleb did not sleep. He lay awake, turning over not the numbers, which were settled now, but the woman who had settled them. He thought about the 6 weeks since she'd come walking up his road, with bruised apples in her hands. He thought about the kitchen that smelled like a home now instead of a chore. He thought about Hutch Boyle wiping his boots without being told, and the men eating slower at supper because the food was worth lingering over, and the ledger that balanced now in ways it hadn't balanced in years. Lydia Harlan had not just fed his house, she had given it a future, and somewhere in the past 6 weeks, without either of them announcing it to the other, Caleb Rowan had stopped being a man who was only surviving his own life, and started, quietly, to want one again. The first snow came the next morning, soft and early, settling on the porch rail Caleb had fixed weeks before without saying why. He found Lydia out there with a cup of coffee, going cold in her hands, watching the snow come down over the creek bottom, that was still, because of her, still his. He stood beside her a while before he spoke. The silence between them had become, over 6 weeks, a comfortable thing, the kind 2 people share when they've learned that not every moment needs filling. "I thought I was hiring a cook," he said finally. "You were," Lydia said. "I got something else." He turned to look at her properly. "You didn't just keep this ranch standing. You gave it a reason to be standing again." She didn't answer right away. She let him finish, the way she'd learned, in 6 weeks, that Caleb Rowan needed to finish his own thoughts in his own time. "The fall work's done," he said. "The men will start drifting off in a few weeks, same as every year. You're free to go wherever you'd like to go, with my thanks and whatever wage you're owed, and then some." He paused, and something in his careful, measured voice roughened just slightly. "But I don't want you to go. I want you to stay in this house, not as my cook." Lydia turned to look at him fully now, the snow settling silent around them both. "As your wife," she said. "As my wife," Caleb said, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked at her without any distance in it at all. "And as a full partner in everything this ranch is, and everything it's going to be." Lydia Harlan, who had spent the last year of her life being looked at as a problem to be quietly solved, looked at this careful, steady man who had never once offered her pity, only respect, and felt something in her chest unlock that she had not let herself feel since the debt collectors first came to her door. She did not throw herself at him. That was not how either of them did things, and they both knew it. She took a slow breath and let the corner of her mouth move, warm and a little wry. "I wondered how long it would take you to ask," she said. "You're a good man, Caleb Rowan. But you do take the long road to a simple door." "I've had a lot of practice taking the long road," he said. "Then it's a fortunate thing," she said, "that I'm patient." She set her cold coffee down on the rail. "Yes, I'll stay, as your wife, as your partner. And Caleb, I expect to see my name in that ledger, same as yours." "It'll be there," he said. "I'd have it no other way now." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in town, on a clear, cold morning with the mountains white behind the steeple. There was no great show to it. Lydia wore a deep green dress she had sewn herself from cloth Caleb had brought back from his last trip into town, the same trip that had brought the good coffee and the new sack of flour, though neither of them had known, at the time, what that trip was truly carrying. Hutch Boyle and the ranch hands stood as witnesses, every one of them scrubbed and pressed for the occasion, looking, Lydia thought, prouder of the day than anyone had a right to be who wasn't actually getting married. She cooked the wedding supper herself, because it did not occur to her to let anyone else do it, and because some things a woman simply does not hand off, even on her own wedding day. But for the first time since she'd walked up that road with bruised apples in her hands, every man at that table called her Mrs. Rowan, and not one of them called her cook. The winter that followed was hard, the way Montana winters always were, but it was a different kind of hard than the one Caleb had known alone for 6 years. Lydia kept the books in order, her careful hand alongside his in the ledger, and by the time the first green came back to the creek bottom in spring, the Rowan Creek note was paid in full, with a surplus set aside that Caleb had not seen in that account in longer than he could remember. Gideon Vale rode back out in April, as men like Vale always do, smiling his careful smile, looking for ground that had gone soft with debt. He found, instead, a table with 2 people sitting at it instead of 1, and a ledger that Lydia opened before Caleb had said a single word. Vale looked at the figures, looked at the woman who had built them, and understood, in the particular cold way of a man recognizing he has lost a game he thought was already won, that there was no easy ground left to take at Rowan Creek. He did not come back a third time. 5 years passed, the way good years do, quickly and full, and without much room left over for keeping score of how fast they'd gone. The Rowan Creek Ranch had grown steady and sound, the herd healthy, the smokehouse a working part of the operation now, instead of a forgotten stone building behind the barn. The house no longer smelled of old grease and cold coffee. It smelled, on any given evening, of bread rising and coffee fresh on the stove, and of the particular warmth that comes from a kitchen that has never once, in 5 years, gone unused. On a clear autumn evening, Caleb and Lydia sat together on the porch he had fixed the rail of so many years before, watching their 2 children chase each other across the yard in the last gold light of the day, the boy with his father's quiet watchfulness, and the girl with her mother's stubborn, capable hands already finding their way into everything. Caleb looked at his wife for a long moment, the way he still did sometimes, as though checking that she was really there. "I asked you that day," he said, "if you could keep a stove warm for 2. Lydia smiled, watching their children in the yard, the ranch behind them solid and alive in a way it had not been in a very long time. "And I always wondered," she said, "if you'd ever learn how to warm a house yourself." He took her hand on the porch rail, the same hand, 5 winters and a whole life later. "I think I finally did," he said. "I just needed someone to show me how." There is a particular kind of strength that doesn't ask to be noticed. It doesn't arrive with a speech or a demand. It arrives quietly, with flour on its hands and a ledger under its arm, and it goes to work on whatever is broken, without waiting to be asked twice. Lydia Harlan did not come to Rowan Creek looking for rescue. She came looking for a place to be useful, and in being useful, she built something neither she nor Caleb Rowan had thought themselves capable of building again. A house that was warm, a ranch that was sound, and a future that belonged to both of them equally. Sometimes the people who walk into our lives don't come asking for help at all. They come carrying exactly what we didn't know we were missing, and all they need from us is one honest question, and a door held open long enough for them to walk through it. If this story warmed something in you tonight, you know what to do. Hit that like button, tell me where you're writing in from, and subscribe if you want to keep finding your way back to this porch. The next story is already on the road. I'll see you there.